Everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be talking with the very well-known, legendary writer, creator, Mike Barrett. Mike, thank you for jumping in and joining.
My pleasure.
Well, thanks so much. And you wrote the first comic I do believe I ever read, which was a Batman annual from back in the late 1980s. And of course, your work speaks for itself. Many of those titles are right there behind you, Nexus and Badger, and all sorts of wonderful work on characters like the Punisher as well. Um, but certainly a wonderful career, and I'm curious about your path to comics. What brought you to the world of comics?
It was a long and winding road. In a minute, my wife is leaving the house, and that noise you hear is the garage door opener closing.
Oh,
And
okay.
and I'm going to let her here. Okay, now you talk for 30 seconds.
Absolutely. I don't think we're getting any sound from the background there, but of course, folks out there will recognize several of those characters on your background. So
All right,
wonderful
we're
homage
good.
there. Okay, great,
All right. The first comic I ever read was Uncle Scrooge, which I picked up in Mitchell, South Dakota, where I grew up. Uh, and I read it, and I was a kid, I was probably 10 or 11. And I recognized that it was exceptional entertainment. It gave me a false idea of the medium because I thought, well, if this is typical of the medium, this is going to be great.
Mhm.
And I started collecting Uncle Scrooge. I even got in touch with the great man, and he sent me a drawing. Uh, but I didn't pursue it as a career or as a hobby until I got to college. And that's when friends showed me the work of Jim Steranko and Neil Adams. And when I
Mhm.
saw that, I was gobsmacked. I had never imagined graphics so fascinating with so much impact. And I'm lucky to have known Neil, and I still know Jim.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, so I started collecting, and like many collectors, I collected on the basis of the art that appealed to me. Uh, And with the exception of a handful of titles, such as Conan the Barbarian, in which Roy Thomas adapted Robert D. Howard's stories, and of course was illustrated by Barry Smith, whom I have always considered one of the greatest artists in the medium, most of the books are very disappointing. Not the art. The art attracted me. I love the art. Uh, but when I read the stories, I thought, "Oh, this is just cliched, shallow nonsense. I don't feel involved or engaged, and the dialogue doesn't ring true." I suppose I was spoiled by reading books because I was an avid reader of novels. I started writing because of John D. MacDonald, specifically his Travis McGee series, which enthralled me, and which was the inspiration for my own biker series.
Mhm. Mhm.
I moved to Boston after graduating because I heard there were papers there that would hire aspiring writers if they could string two words together. But the first job I had in Boston was smoking marijuana for the government. I answered a classified ad in the back pages of the Boston Phoenix, and I lived on a hospital ward in Mattapan for a month. We took tests every day. We smoked a lot of weed, and then we took tests for cognition and reasoning. It
Uh-huh.
was just like college. And when I got out, I wrote that up and I sold it to the Boston Phoenix. And a few years later, I became their music editor. I have
Nice.
always loved music. Uh, I have always written about music, and I'm still writing about music just to get the free records. But that I always wanted to write fiction. Fiction was my main love. I tried to write novels, but I had no clue what I was doing, and they were dreadful, and I knew that, so I set them aside. But when I moved back to Madison, Wisconsin, where I went to college, I was working at an insurance company when an editor called me and said, "We got a guy down here trying to sell us his pictures, and
Mhm.
you ought to take a look." So he gave me Steve Root's phone number,
Mhm.
And we
Mhm.
met on the steps of the student union, and he laid his portfolio out for me. And right there, I gave up drawing, trying to be an artist. And I said, dude, what do you want to do? He said, well, I want to do comics. What do you want to do? I said, no, he said, I want to do comics, but I can't write. What do you want to do? And so our partnership was born, and we were in the right place at the right time in the capital city distribution, which at the time was a multi-million dollar multinational company distributing comics, decided to publish their own line. And they said, we want a superhero.
Mhm.
So I went home, I dreamed up Nexus, and I wrote the first 12 pages, and I wrote them by drawing them out by hand, which is how I wrote comics for 20 years. I said I gave up on being a professional artist, but I had worked at it for a long time, and my art is good enough that anybody can tell at a glance what I'm drawing, be it a single face or a whole village scene. I know what to do.
Mhm.
Uh, and I wrote the comic by drawing the page out on a legal pad and then putting in the first panel, and then thinking, what goes here? What's a compelling introduction? And I realized, well, somebody dies.
Mhm.
Every
Mhm.
time the hero shows up, that's compelling. And that's not a new insight. It's the reason why criminal and law shows and legal shows and medical shows have dominated our popular culture for a half century because they deal with life and death.
Mhm.
And that's the stuff of drama. So I do that first panel, and it was about a dictator loosely based on some South American tyrant celebrating his latest human rights abuse when word suddenly reaches him that there's an avenger in the hall coming to get him, and that built up for the suspense to Nexus' arrival. And the first time we see him, he's executing this guy.
Uh-huh.
But I didn't want Nexus to be a heartless killer. So I made him a reluctant executioner of mass murderers. And all this came about through a very intricate backstory, which is readily available. And we just started working it and working it. And the world of Nexus grew and grew to become one of the greatest world building foundations in science fiction history. That goes for comics and novels. And anybody who has read the book knows what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I took the 12 pages and I gave them to the dude, and he drew them up and inked them and lettered them. And we took them to the boys, and they took one look and they read a page and said, yeah, now give us 20 more pages. And so my career in comics began. And I thought, well, I got some hot guy, I got some eager fish on the line here. I better come up with another concept.
Mhm.
And so I created the Badger. And there's so much that went into the introduction of the Badger, but it's no great mystery. I lived in Madison, Wisconsin. The university team is called the Badgers. The Badger is the state animal. I walked down State Street, there's Badger Liquors, Badger Pub. And I said, all right, the Badger. I always say I don't choose my stories choose me.
Yeah.
But at the time, I was reading The Minds of Billy Milligan by Daniel Keyes, who was a great science fiction writer. But The Minds of
Mhm.
Billy Milligan was a factual study of a multiple personality. In fact, it was the very first factual study of a multiple. So I decided to make Badger multiple personality, only one of which is a costume crime fighter. And of course, that's the most compelling figure. And I stuck with him for the most part. And we did delve into tragedy from
Mhm.
time to time, specifically with a four-issue series I did for Dark Horse called The Broken Mirror that was illustrated by Jill Thompson, because all cases of multiple personality are born of severe childhood trauma, some of it sexually related, but other not. Uh, and I touched on that occasionally because it's a very dark subject, and I wanted the Badger to be fun. And most of the stories are fun. He was a kind of crazy, anything goes guy, and readers responded to that. And they also responded to the unique language that I gave him. As you know, if you read a memorable phrase in context for the first time, it will stay with you forever, such as Avengers Assemble, Face
Hmm.
It Tiger, You Just Hit the Jackpot, things that Stan Lee wrote and appeared for the first time in a context that he created of the superhero universe, uh, that were memorable because of context and freshness. And of course, those cliches have been beaten into the ground now. Uh, and I would advise readers not to use them.
Hmm.
If you ever, you know, comics are the most forgiving medium on earth. Everybody thinks they can do a comic, and they do. So most comics are pretty bad. There was a great science fiction writer named Theodore Sturgeon, and
Hmm.
Sturgeon created Sturgeon's Law. And Sturgeon's Law says 80% of every, no, 90% of everything is crap. And he was right. 90% of the music that gets released is crap. 90% of the movies, the TVs, and the comics, it's crap, crap, crap. Only 10% is worthwhile. And that's especially egregious in comics because it seems so simple. It's just words and pictures on paper. And that's why everybody thinks that they can do a comic, and everybody does. But that doesn't mean it's going to be any good. Comics are a medium like any other, and you have to
Hmm.
understand the medium, what it can and cannot do, in order to make it pay off in a worthwhile way. Uh, my goal with any story is first and foremost entertainment. I never lose sight of that fact. I want every part of that comic to be entertaining. I don't want a wasted word or a wasted picture. Every time I go through anything I wrote, anytime, I will find a way to improve it by taking words out.
Hmm. Hmm.
I read most comics are they're incredibly verbose, and it interferes with the comic. Uh, the less words you use, the more impact they will have. I am not in favor of wordless comics. They may be beautiful to behold, but you read them in 5 minutes or 15 minutes if it's a graphic novel, and
Hmm.
you say, "Yeah, that's a pretty picture," and then you forget about it completely because there's no story. I mean, you can tell a story, but it's the words judiciously used that make that story sing, that make it memorable. The, the key to that is having your characters sound like real people. And here's where
Hmm.
most writers go wrong because they've absorbed this Stan Lee argot, and they always end up writing, "Darest thou insult me, thou slithering worm? Turn and kneel before the Almighty," whatever, crap like that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And you know, if you've seen it once, you've seen it 1,000 times, and you have to find a way around that. You
Hmm.
have to take your comic seriously, as seriously as a good movie or a novel, and make it as real as possible. And the way to do that is to write dialogue that sounds the way people actually talk. That does not mean it has to be cliched, run of the mill dialogue, although a lot of times it is when people are saying, "Where are you going?" "I'm going out to the store. Can I come?" "Sure." If that's appropriate to the page, that's the way I'll write it. Uh, but you also want to use your words to characterize, uh,
Hmm.
to make a character unique. And here's where a lot of people go wrong. They get it into their head. Well, here's an awful villain. If I make him talk like an upper class British gentleman or something, uh, that will make him stand out. You know, I should have prepared some examples of this to read to you beforehand because there are so many examples, but it doesn't because they all sound alike. And that's why you have to seek your own language. And that's why
Hmm.
anybody who's serious about writing must carry a pen and a pad with him at all times.
Love it.
And you
Hmm.
keep your ears open, you eavesdrop. I'm always listening to other people talk uh, to try and catch an idiom, which is a term for a commonly used phrase that may not necessarily be perfect English, but it's the way people talk.
Hmm.
Uh, and when you catch those, you write them down. They don't all have to be super simple. Some of them can be a little more complicated. I mean, you say, well, why use a 25-cent word when you can use a nickel word? And for the most part, I subscribe to that. But occasionally, the 25-cent word is called for.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's also okay to create your own language. Uh, when I wrote The Badger, I didn't create this, but there's a phrase that uh, Norwegian Americans favors oofda, like holy shit, only it's oofda. And Badger uses that all the time because it's Wisconsin, which was largely settled by Scandinavians. And that's just a tiny example. But I'll make things up and I'll use them uh, if they make sense. So it's okay to create your own words if they make sense in context. And an example of that is one of my favorite crime writers is James Elroy. You may not know the name, but
Hmm.
you've all seen L.A. Confidential, and he wrote the book for that. And I was reading one of his novels, and he said, I brodied the big car up the hill, and I knew instinctively what he meant. The hill was slippery, and it was a big Pontiac. And when he said I brodied, he meant I turned the wheel and stepped on the gas one way. Then
Hmm.
I slacked off. Then I turned the wheel and stepped on the gas the other way so that he zigzagged up the hill. And that's what he meant by I brodied the car up the hill. I
Hmm.
just knew that instinctively. I looked it up. The word doesn't exist in that context, but he used it, and now it does.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. What a great example of how to use language. And you mentioned stories being life or death in so many cases. What would you say drives you as a storyteller? What inspires you most to tell stories?
Well, as I said, my number one rule is to entertain. I
Hmm.
think that all good writers write to please themselves with the understanding that they have to catch as wide an audience as possible. And I'm also thinking of the audience, but we like genre fiction.
Hmm.
We like noir, superheroes, horror, barbarians. So liking that is half the battle because you know you've got an audience out there. Uh, and you've got to like your characters. You've got to have fun writing. Uh, I think a writer has to surprise himself before he can can surprise others. Uh, so for me, increasingly, and this is so strange at this stage in my career, but I enjoy writing more than ever.
Hmm.
And part of it
Awesome.
is the joy of creation because I understand story now. And once you understand story, you don't make any wrong turns. I mean, those of us who are writers, we've all have friends saying, "Oh, I've written a novel. I don't know if it's any good. Would you take a look at it?" Well, once you understand story, you don't make a wrong turn. You don't wonder if it's any good.
Hmm.
You know it's good. If it's not good, you're not going to put it out there. And when I was young, I would just sit down and wing it and try to write a novel without even writing an outline. Very few people can do that.
Hmm.
Elmore Leonard is one of them. My friend Pete Brandvold is another, but not me. I learned the hard way that you have to put that story together bit by bit, piece by piece. And that's where the notepad comes in. When I get an idea for a story, an idea can be something as vague as I want to write a hard boiled detective story set in the 60s.
Hmm. Hmm.
And once you focus down to that, I think, well, where will it take place? Who's my protagonist? What are they doing? Who are the criminals? And you make notes. You write down everything and anything that could pertain to that. And some of it might be history, the history of the mob. Some of it might be names that intrigue you that have not been widely used. Uh, and some of it is the research that you do. And at a certain point, when I've been thinking about it and making notes for maybe a month, I reach what I call a critical mass, where I can see the outline of the story. And from there, I work an outline. I work up an outline.
Hmm.
And I invariably veer away from that outline while I'm writing. But that's all right because the outline sets me free to move forward. And it's not like I don't know what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next is revealed to me by the story I've written so far. And every good writer knows this. If you create a compelling character that you believe in, that the reader will believe, at some point, he or she is going to turn around and tell you what they're going to do next.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's a great benefit in writing and also research. Uh, you're researching something and you may want to know, well, for example, in the case of Florida Man, uh, I say, well, what are the worst invasive species in Florida? And I go there and I read about them.
Mhm.
And I find out about the anaconda, the Burmese python. It's actually the python, the Burmese python, which is probably the worst big invasive species because it plays havoc among small mammals. It's eating the raccoons, the possums, what have you. Um, it's so bad that once a year, the state of Florida has a python call. You get yourself a license, you go out, you kill the pythons, and there's a prize for the biggest python. Whoever kills the biggest python, man, there are some big pythons down there. Well, that was
Wow.
perfect for Florida, man. So that ended up in one of my books, and then later in the graphic novel.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's just an example of where research can lead you. Now, I could play with the invasive species of Florida to the end of time and fill novel after novel with that stuff. But Florida Man is a lot more than that. And the reason I wrote Florida Man is that every time I went online, there was another Florida Man story, and many of them are often lurid and unsavory, such as Florida Man insists syringe found in rectum is not his. That's a real type. That's a real headline, and
Yeah.
there are thousands of them. But I wanted my character Gary Duba to be sympathetic, and the key is Gary's just a redneck living down by the swamp in a trailer. He likes to get high. He likes to get stoned. He's got a hair trigger temper. He's been
Mhm.
in and out of trouble with the law his whole life, but he's got a heart of gold and he'd give you the shirt off his back. And that's what makes Gary so appealing. He gets in one adventure after another, one ludicrous situation after another, and that's the key to Florida Man's appeal. He's always on a get rich quick scheme, and in the latest graphic novel, in fact, he does participate in the Python call, and there's a tech billionaire in Florida who's offering $100,000 to whoever brings in the largest python. And Gary's sitting at the end of his pier, depressed with a samurai sword. And how he got the samurai sword is another long story. And he looks up, and there's this enormous python dangling from a tree branch, gripping a flamingo, and he runs out and slices its head off with one whack. And then he puts the python in the back of his truck and he drives up to the tech billionaire's home and he says, "Hey, I think I got the prize here." And the billionaire comes out and says, "Well, yeah, but what's with the duct tape?" And Gary says, "Well, I cut his head off and I had to reattach it to get the full length."
Nice, nice. Yeah. So you have Florida Man. Are there any other particular directions, current work that's inspiring you? I believe, shared an image with me of something along the lines of Sherlock Holmes, was it?
Sherlock Holmes and Captain Nemo team up to
Hmm.
save the world. Do you have the video? I can get you the video.
When a series of shipping disasters points to a mysterious sea monster, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson leave the comfort of Baker Street and board a freighter where they encounter unexpected betrayal and come face to face with the enigmatic Captain Nemo and his submarine, the Nautilus. As they delve deeper into the case, they uncover a conspiracy involving a Russian Tsar with an airship that rains destruction on unsuspecting cities. With time running out and the world on the brink of war, the heroes must use all their skills and resources to stop a massive conspiracy and prevent global conflict. From Eisner-winning writer Mike Barron and illustrator Richard Bonk, dive into the depths of adventure and unravel the mysteries of the sea with the world's greatest detective in Leviathan. Order now at baroncomics.com.
Quite nice.
You can get it at Fund My Comic, Indiegogo, or Kickstarter. And we were very surprised uh, yesterday to find that Kickstarter had chosen Leviathan as one of the projects they love. But,
Nice,
yeah,
nice,
but
very
you
cool.
know, I don't, but who doesn't love Sherlock Holmes? So that's one of the reasons I wrote it.
Yeah. Well, and Jules Verne right there with Captain
Yeah,
Nemo. I
yeah,
mean, yeah,
yeah. Plus a
absolutely.
few surprise guests I can't mention this time, but you're going to blow your mind when you read the book.
Nice, nice. So you have that going on. Very exciting. How long does the campaign go for?
Oh, I think we got about 35 days to go.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So we're catching this early. That gives me plenty of time to get it out. If you were to go back and talk to a younger Mike Barron, what writing advice would you want to give that person?
Always carry a pad and a pen with you at all times, seriously. And
I like
other
it.
than that, I'd say uh, experience life. Don't just write what you know. I mean, they tell you to write what you know, and that's good advice if you have a compelling story. But for those of us who want to write genre fiction, we have to imagine every point of view. It's the writer's job to imagine every point of view of every character in his book, and a
Mhm.
good writer can do that. And that requires empathy, and it also requires research. So don't slack off on empathy and research. Get to know the people you're going to write about so that you can write them convincingly. Shakespeare wrote Othello. It's very convincing. Alexander Dumas wrote The Three Musketeers. It's one of the classics of English literature. Many people don't know that Alexander Dumas was a Haitian. He was black.
Mhm. Mhm.
And William Styron wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner and Sophie's Choice, put himself in the heads of a rebellious civil warrior slave and a woman sent to Auschwitz for bad thought during Nazi Germany. And they're absolutely convincing. Of course, these were seasoned professional writers. They didn't come out of the gate like that.
Mhm.
Uh, John Brain, the great English novelist, wrote a book called Writing Your Novel, and he says nobody should attempt to write a novel before they're 40 years old. They simply don't have enough experience to make it credible. And there are exceptions to that. William Styron is one of them. I think he wrote As I Lay Dying when he was 24.
Wow.
But most of us, most novelists, come to the profession a little bit later.
Mhm. Well, I hope that folks out there will go check out baroncomics.com where they can see your work and any other spaces that you'd like to remind us about.
Well, I'm on Twitter at Bloody Red Baron. I'm on Facebook at Michael A. Baron. I have a Substack column where I write frequently about writing. It's called mikebaron.substack.com. Just go to Substack and type in Mike Baron. It'll take you right to it. The thing about baroncomics.com is it's got everything I've produced in the last 3 years, from Florida Man to Thin Blue Line to Private American to Nexus and now Sherlock Holmes. And we're just getting started. We have so many projects in the pipeline. It's crazy. I wish that we could do more than 3 or 4 a year. This year we only are getting to do three because my showrunner and guru, Chris Brawley, has been so busy. He's a professional videographer, uh, and he was very busy recently running around Tennessee and Kentucky, uh, taping the evidence of the hurricane's damage
Oh yeah,
for
yeah.
insurance companies. I mean, that's what, and it took a lot of time. And he does a lot of videography for big businesses. He's the best videographer in Chattanooga, probably in Tennessee.
Mm, that's
So that
nice.
takes time, you know. But while he's doing that, I'm working on other things. I'm writing novels. I'm writing for the Rippaverse.
Yeah, yeah. You are a busy person and
I
prolific.
am. You know what the Rippaverse is, don't you?
I do indeed.
Yeah, I got a Rippa book. I got a Rippa book right here.
Nice.
This is by the Soska twins, who are my editors. Here's the one I just wrote.
Nice, nice. Some science fiction, mythological work there. I can always, I know that I'm going to be in for an interesting story when I'm reading one of your books, whether it's prose or graphic novel or whatever form.
Well, thank you. Really, the only science fiction I write is Nexus. And I suppose to a certain degree, the Rippaverse books including a title I created, but I can't tell you now because of a non-disclosure agreement, but it'll be announced shortly. That they certainly touch on science fiction. They touch on superheroics. And the challenge with superheroes is to make them credible, to make
Mhm.
readers believe. They're a fantastic concept. Uh, when Simon and Schuster introduced Superman in 1939, it was a brilliant idea. It caught on. It was pulp. People loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. But
Mhm.
it wasn't until the 80s when film was caught up with special effects enough to make you believe that a man could fly, which
Mhm.
of course
Mhm.
was the tagline for the Christopher Reeve movie, which was the first representation of Superman on film that you could enter into completely
Mhm.
and think, yeah, this is really happening. I mean, there was Superman before. There was George Reeves, of course, did the TV show, but anybody who's watched that knows that it's just on a set someplace, and George is hanging from guy wires while a big fan makes his cape flow out behind him,
Right,
and we
right.
kind of all agree to suspend our disbelief in order to enjoy the story. But now special effects have gotten to the stage where they can put anything on the screen and make it look real.
Sure enough, sure enough. It's a good time to be a comics fan, a science fiction fan, and somebody that enjoys stories for sure. Yeah. Well, I hope you'll consider this a space to come back to. It's an open invitation anytime you want to talk about work as it comes to be and as you're launching projects. And it's such a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you for
Thank you,
coming
sir.
on.
I will.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks so much.